Right now, philosophy. It's already too late, philosophy. This is what you and I need to get with. And the only way we're going to solve our problem is with a self-help program. Before we can get a self-help program started, we have to have a self-help philosophy. Black nationalism is a self-help philosophy. What's so good about it, you can stay right in the church where you are and still take black nationalism as your philosophy. You can stay in any kind of civic organization that you belong to and still take black nationalism as your philosophy. You can be an atheist and still take black nationalism as your philosophy. This is a philosophy that eliminates the necessity for division and argument. Because if you're black, you should be thinking black. And if you're black and you're not thinking black at this late date, well, I'm sorry for you. Once you change your philosophy, you change your thought pattern. Once you change your thought pattern, you change your attitude. Once you change your attitude, it changes your behavior pattern. And then you go on into some action. As long as you got a sit-down philosophy, you'll have a sit-down thought pattern. And as long as you think that old sit-down thought, you'll be in some kind of sit-down action. They'll have you sitting in everywhere. It's not so good to refer to what you're going to do as a sit-in. That right there castrates you. Right there it brings you down. What goes with it? Think of the image of someone sitting. An old woman can sit. An old man can sit. A chump can sit. A coward can sit. Anything can sit. Well, you and I have been sitting long enough, and it's time today for us to start doing some standing and some fighting to back that up. When we look at other parts of this earth upon which we live, we find that black, brown, red, and yellow people in Africa and Asia are getting their independence. They're not getting it by singing, "We shall overcome." No, they're getting it through nationalism. It is nationalism that brought about the independence of the people in Asia. Every nation in Asia gained its independence through the philosophy of nationalism. Every nation on the African continent that has gotten its independence brought it about through the philosophy of nationalism. And it will take black nationalism to bring about the freedom of 22 million Afro-Americans here in this country where we have suffered colonialism for the past 400 years. Just as much a colonial power as England ever was. America is just as much a colonial power as France ever was. In fact, America is more so a colonial power than they, because she's a hypocritical colonial power behind it. What do you call second-class citizenship? Why, that's colonization. Second-class citizenship is nothing but 20th century slavery. How are you going to tell me you're a second-class citizen? They don't have second-class citizenship in any other government on this earth. They just have slaves and people who are free. Well, this country is a hypocrite. They try and make you think they set you free by calling you a second-class citizen. No, you're nothing but a 20th century slave. Just as it took nationalism to remove colonialism from Asia and Africa, it'll take black nationalism today to remove colonialism from the backs and the minds of 22 million Afro-Americans here in this country. And 1964 looks like it might be the year of the ballot or the bullet. Why does it look like it might be the year of the ballot or the bullet? Because Negroes have listened to the trickery and the lies and the false promises of the white man now for too long. And they're fed up. They've become disenchanted. They've become disillusioned. They've become dissatisfied. And all of this has built up frustrations in the black community that makes the black community throughout America today more explosive than all of the atomic bombs the Russians can ever invent. Whenever you got a racial powder keg sitting in your lap, you're in more trouble than if you had an atomic powder keg sitting in your lap. When a racial powder keg goes off, it doesn't care who it knocks out the way. Understand this, it's dangerous. And in 1964, this seems to be the year. Because what can the white man use now to fool us? After he put down that march on Washington, and you see all through that now, he tricked you, had you marching down to Washington. Yes, had you marching back and forth between the feet of a dead man named Lincoln and another dead man named George Washington, singing "We Shall Overcome." He made a chump out of you. He made a fool out of you. He made you think you were going somewhere, and you end up going nowhere but between Lincoln and Washington. So today our people are disillusioned. They've become disenchanted. They've become dissatisfied. And in their frustrations, they want action. And in 1964, you see this young black man, this new generation. So today, our people are disillusioned. They've become disenchanted. They've become dissatisfied. And in their frustrations, they want action. You see this young black man, this new generation, asking for the ballot or the vote. That old Uncle Tom action is outdated. The young generation don't want to hear anything about the odds are against us. What do we care about odds? When this country here was first being founded, there were 13 colonies. The whites were colonized. They were fed up with this taxation without representation. So some of them stood up and said, liberty or death. I went to a white school over here in Mason, Michigan. The white man made the mistake of letting me read his history books. He made the mistake of teaching me that Patrick Henry was a patriot. And George Washington wasn't nothing nonviolent about old Pat or George Washington. Liberty or death was what brought about the freedom of whites in this country from the English. They didn't care about the arts, but they faced the wrath of the entire British Empire. And in those days, they used to say that the British Empire was so vast and so powerful when the sun would never set on it. This is how big it was. Yet these 13 little scrawny states, tired of taxation without representation, tired of being exploited and oppressed and degraded, told that big British Empire, liberty or death. And here you have 22 million Afro-Americans, black people today, catching more hell than Patrick Henry ever saw. And I'm here to tell you, in case you don't know it, that you got a new generation of black people in this country who don't care anything whatsoever about odds. They don't want to hear you old Uncle Tom handkerchief head talking about the odds. No. This is a new generation. If they're going to draft these young black men and send them over to Korea or South Vietnam to face 800 million Chinese, if you're not afraid of those odds, you shouldn't be afraid of these odds. Why does this loom to be such an explosive political year? Because this is the year of politics. This is the year when all of the white politicians are going to come into the Negro community. You never see them until election time. You can't blame them until election time. They're going to come in with false promises. And as they make these false promises, they're going to feed our frustrations. And this will only serve to make matters worse. I'm no politician. I'm not even a student of politics. I'm not a Republican, nor a Democrat, nor an American, and got sense enough to know it. I'm one of the 22 million black victims of the Democrats. One of the 22 million black victims of the Republicans, and one of the 22 million black victims of Americanism. And when I speak, I don't speak as a Democrat or a Republican. I speak as a victim of America's so-called democracy. You and I have never seen democracy. All we've seen is hypocrisy. When we open our eyes today and look around America, we see America not through the eyes of someone who has enjoyed the fruits of Americanism. We see America through the eyes of someone who has been the victim of Americanism. We don't see any American dream. We've experienced only the American nightmare. We haven't benefited from America's democracy. We've only suffered from America's hypocrisy. And the generation that's coming up now can see it and are not afraid to say it. If you go to jail, so what? If you're black, you were born in jail. If you black, you were born in jail. In the North as well as the South. Stop talking about the South. As long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're South. Don't call Governor Wallace a Dixie governor. Romney is a Dixie governor. $22 million black victims of Americanism are waking up. And they're gaining a new political consciousness, becoming politically mature. And as they develop this political maturity, they're able to see the recent trends in these political elections. They see that the whites are so evenly divided that every time they vote, the race is so close, they have to go back and count the votes all over again. And which means that any bloc, any minority that has a block of votes that stick together is in a strategic position. Either way you go, that's who gets it. You're in a position to determine who goes to the White House and who stay in the doghouse. You're the one who has that power. You can keep Johnson in Washington, D.C., or you can send him back to his Texas cotton patch. You're the one who sent Kennedy to Washington. You're the one who put the present Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. The whites were evenly divided. It was the fact that you threw 80% of your votes behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House. When you see this, you can see that the Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are in a position to be the determining factor, what do you get out of it? The Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years. And all other legislation they wanted to bring up, they brought it up and gotten it out of the way, and now they bring up you. And now they bring up you. You put them first, and they put you last. Because you're a chump. A political chump. In Washington, D.C., in the House of Representatives, there are 257 who are Democrats. Only 177 are Republicans. In the Senate, there are 67 Democrats. Only 33 are Republicans. The party that you bash controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and still they can't keep their promise to you because you're a chump. Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you are dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race. And what kind of alibi do they come up with? They try and pass the buck to the Dixiecrats. Now, back during the days when you were blind, deaf, and dumb, ignorant, politically immature, naturally you went along with that. But today, as your eyes come open and you develop political maturity, you're able to see and think for yourself. And you can see that a Dixiecrat is nothing but a Democrat in disguise. You look at the structure of the government that controls this country. It's controlled by 16 senatorial committees and 20 congressional committees. Of the 16 senatorial committees that run the government, 10 of them are in the hands of Southern segregationists. Of the 20 congressional committees that run the government, 12 of them are in the hands of Southern segregationists. And they're going to tell you and me that the South lost the war. You today are in the hands of a government of segregationists, racists, white supremacists, who belong to the Democratic Party but disguise themselves as Dixiecrats. Dixiecrat is nothing but a Democrat. Whoever runs the Democrats is also the father of the Dixiecrats. And the father of all of them is sitting in the White House. I say it again. You got a president who's nothing but a Southern segregationist. From the state of Texas. They'll lynch you in Texas as quick as they'll lynch you in Mississippi. Only in Texas, they lynch you with a Texas accent. In Mississippi, they lynch you with a Mississippi accent. And the first thing the cracker does when he comes in power, he takes all the Negro leaders and invites them for a coffee to show that he's all right. And those Uncle Toms can't pass up the coffee. They come away from the coffee table telling you and me that this man is all right. Because he's from the South. And since he's from the South, he can deal with the South. And look at the logic that they're using. What about Eastland? He's from the South. Make him the president. If Johnson is a good man because he's from Texas, and then from Texas will enable, if Johnson is a good man because he's from Texas, and then from Texas will enable him to deal with the South, Eastland can deal with the South better than Johnson. Oh, I say, you've been misled. You've been had. You've been took. I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago while the senators were filibustering. And I noticed in the back of the Senate a huge map. And on this map, it showed the distribution of Negroes in America. And surprisingly, the same senators that were involved in the filibuster were from the states where there were the most Negroes. Why were they filibustering the civil rights legislation? Because the civil rights legislation is supposed to guarantee voting rights to Negroes in those states. And those senators from those states know that if the Negroes in those states can vote, those senators are down the drain. The representatives of those states go down the drain. And in the Constitution of this country, it has a stipulation wherein whenever the voting rights of people in a certain district are violated, then the representative who's from that particular district, according to the Constitution, is supposed to be expelled from the Congress. Now, if this particular aspect of the Constitution was enforced, why, you wouldn't have a cracker in Washington, D.C. But what will happen when you expel the Dixiecrat? You're expelling the Democrat. When you destroy the power of the Dixiecrat, you're destroying the power of the Democratic Party. So how in the world can the Democratic Party in the South actually side with you in sincerity when all of its power is based in the South? These Northern Democrats are in cahoots with the Southern Democrats. They're playing a giant con game, a political con game. You know how it goes. One of them comes to you and make believe he's for you. And he's in cahoots with the other one that's not for you. Right, because neither one of them is for you. But they got to make you go with one of them or the other. So this is a con game. And this is what they've been doing with you and me all these years. First thing Johnson got off the plane, when he became president, he asked, where's Dickie? You know who Dickie is? Dickie is old Southern cracker Richard Russell. Yeah, yes. Lyndon B. Johnson's best friend is the one who is ahead, who's heading the forces that are filibustering civil rights legislation. You tell me, how in the hell is he going to be Johnson's best friend?
That was a little bit over. That was a good 21 minutes. So, what about that part stood out to y'all?
You know, I really identified with when
Oh, hold on. Let me do this. You could still.
when you said liberty or death. I just thought that was like a really great I don't know idea to just kind of throw back into the face of people who would probably not
Would
respond.
demonize
Yeah.
others for doing the same and having the same determination for self-preservation. Very hypocritical. And I think he did a very good job at just really descripting the hypocrisy of the American democracy. And a quote that he also in support of that was, the liberty or death is what brought about the liberation of white people here. You and I, speaking directly to black folks, have never seen democracy here, only hypocrisy. And I find that very relevant today because we get a person like, no shade, Joe Biden, who says, you ain't black if you don't vote for me. And then we have folks who really make a argument or try to create an argument for how to interpret what he said. Um, and that goes towards the one of his later quotes about being a traitor to your own race ideologically, and how we all know that there are some black folks who have the ideas and who holds the ideas of, in short, white supremacy through the intent to preserve ways of living and being for being the token one in that community. Um, but that they are also victims of Americanism, which is something that he goes in great length about. Um, kind of cushioning you up to believe that you have an active role, but at the same time going into the back room with Dickie, or the one who was leading the filibuster and calling him your best friend. Though you guys are on two polar opposites on this basically human issue, and you're calling it a political issue, but it's really our human life that you guys are playing.
Thought experiments with.
Yeah. So yeah, that's and it just kind of reminded me of like the black churches when they went into Trump's office for that photo op. I'm still trying to figure out what was done with that photo. What was meaningfully done, and I think he just goes really great. And then he talks on what is oppression and brings forth a direct action as instructed by the Constitution, which I feel like we as a society of citizens, we love to tout those when it's pleasurable and it affirms our position. But then when it's brought up in opposition of our position, we like to kind of divert the conversation away from what the Constitution is supposed to mean for our moral conduct as a nationhood, and it just goes further into the hypocrisy.
I think what stood out for her. Did you ever response? Did you ever say something? Yeah. I don't know. Okay. Well, what stood out to me in that is that I'm one of 22 million black victims of Democrats, one of 22 million black victims of the Republicans, and one of the 22 million black victims of Americanism. I think that just kind of encompasses what I feel, because I like how he says he doesn't really describe himself as either of them, because all of them at every turn leave us behind, and it's pretty much their strategy is to pretend to give us some of the bar, but only to get us to engage and to be a part of it, and in a way that they can still have control. I think a huge problem, and something that he also touched upon, is that we do need to re-educate about what the political atmosphere is, what that means, and how that's going to impact our communities. Because it's important to be engaged, but it's also important to know how to engage, and so that you can engage in a way that's going to be beneficial to you, in my opinion. And so I think that that part stood out to me a lot, because even in today's day and age, growing up, of course, I considered myself a Democrat when I was a little bit younger, only 25. But in the mindset now, speaking of Joe Biden and Trump, I don't consider myself a Democrat or Republican, but it's always about the lesser of two evils. And now that we're older, we understand that a little bit. We know Joe Biden's better than Trump, but it's the fact that we have to keep having this conversation and keep coming into this space of not really having a choice. And to me, it's the strategy of America's political system, but really all of the systems within. When you look at education, when you look at even transportation, and who's the victims of being kept out of, or having to do more, or having to find more of those resources, it usually is Black people or people of color in general. And so I think that part really spoke to me, just because to me it encompasses so much more than just those words itself, and those words that he used itself.
Anything else? I also wanted to touch on his kind of talk about the divide generationally, because I myself um, find a divide now between generations, and the intent of my work is to be a buffer and to connect others who can be buffers for the gaps within our intergenerational leadership. But in part, this part of his speech is a clear is in clear opposition to the nonviolent philosophy. He he talks about the generational divide and how that nonviolent philosophy sounded really good to, you know, the folks who wasn't necessarily out there getting sprayed down with the hose and things, but were kind of at that table talking with these folks because they're the churchgoers, they're the senior members of the community who are equally, you know, out there. But like he talks about this younger generation kind of being willing to take on that liberty or death mentality by any means necessary, as he would say. And it just kind of then has me to think about what happened to that generation, and then it reminds me that the crack epidemic
They were in prison, yeah.
happened right after 1968, 1970. Around that turn of the decade, there were mass incarceration. There was kind of like there was a backlash to the murder of Martin Luther King that lasted a couple years, and then there was a swift, systemic, like behavioral correction for those who they consider to be potentially extreme. Hence the rise of the Black Panther Party and COINTELPRO, which was already, you know, in implementation already through most of the 60s because it was headed by J. Edgar Hoover. But it really brought into awareness like that generation was kind of lost because they were drugged and they were imprisoned. And a lot of them still are either in prison, those who had the radical idea to organize, like the New York 21, or you know, stuff like that.
I don't know. Well, to that, to what you're saying, when you brought up the younger generation, then speaking around 1964, thinking about when one of my grandmas was born. She was born, you know, closer to the early 1950s, but she would be amongst that generation, and we've had a lot of conversations about her growing up in her history and her involvement. But I think about in those conversations this type of ideology, as Malcolm X talks about that generation and where they were, and they're not listening, or really there's no compromise because we want to get to this now, and we're tired of negotiation, we're tired of talking, et cetera, et cetera. And I never really got that from my grandma or any of my elders from that generation, my great aunts, or any of that. So I thought that was really interesting because even as you bring up, you know, the crack epidemic and, you know, the mass incarceration and the brutalization of our communities within that, between that time, I didn't really think about that as I was thinking about those conversations with my grandma, because I was like, God, what really makes her different? Or those conversations with others that are in her age, what really makes it different? Because their mind, some I do know who had kind of the same mindset that Malcolm X would have, and are still in that, in the aesthetic of a freedom fighter. But a lot of my conversations, I don't know if y'all have that experience with elders, has not been in the mindset of Malcolm X, which is interesting to me because the generation that he's talking about, which would be more closely to our generation, in my opinion, would be our elders, like folks who are in their 60s and 50s, and
Some
those
of our
folks. So
well, they'll be our parents.
our parents, our grandparents, and so like I think about my conversations that I've had with them, and a lot of them, all of them are black, but like a lot of them don't really fit that. So I'm curious to know. I wonder what happened in the midst of that, because my grandma was involved in a lot of organizations, especially for Black liberation and stuff, and some of my other family members, and their mindsets are still, you know, there, but it's more so in nonviolent aspects,
So then
which is really interesting because I don't know. I'm trying to figure out. She never really talked. They never really talked about Martin Luther King Jr. or Angela Davis. It was more so about Huey and BPP and Seal and Malcolm X. So it's just really interesting because we've all heard the speech before, but as we're older and as we talk about it and break it apart, it kind of brings up some memories of conversations and what that actually means because it makes you want to revisit that. Like, okay, well, you were a part of this generation, so was this your ideologies? Was this your thought process? And what changed if it was? Or, where are you at now? What what I got from that.
You look like you had something to say.
It's gone now.
Usually happens when I talk.
Well, yeah. So let's just go ahead and get into the next part.